He was digging a well, hoping to find water, but instead he uncovered an ancient golden bull statue hidden beneath the ground. When everyone found out what he did with the discovery, they were left in shock. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The summer sun had turned the valley into a bowl of ash and heat. Each morning, the wind swept dust across the fields, coating the dry grass in a pale film that shimmered beneath the light like old bones. The air carried the taste of metal and grit. On what had once been a proud pasture, the earth had cracked open in thin, jagged lines, splitting the soil like broken glass. The drought had lasted nearly 2 years now. The radio in town said it was the worst in a century. Wells were failing all across the county, and those who still had a little water guarded it the way their grandfathers had once guarded gold. Clarence Harper stood at the edge of what used to be his north field. A wide-brim hat pulled low over his brow, and surveyed the land that had belonged to his family for 4 generations. He had always thought the land was alive, breathing, whispering, even when the wind was silent. But now it seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something that would not come. The grass was gone. The cattle were thin. The wooden posts that marked his fences leaned like tired old men, and even the crows had stopped visiting the fence lines. Somewhere behind him, his old dog Rusty barked once, a half-hearted sound, and then fell quiet. The Harper Ranch had been granted to Clarence's great-grandfather after the war, land given to freedmen carved out of the forgotten stretches of Texas prairie. His great-grandfather had built a shack, planted corn, and dug the first well by hand. Clarence had grown up hearing those stories, the ones his grandfather used to tell while sitting on the porch as the sun went down. He'd point to the old dry well by the barn and say, "That's where we found water, boy. That's where our name began." But now that well was nothing more than a pit of dust, the stones crumbling around its rim. Each day Clarence rose before dawn, his back stiff from the cot in the corner of his small farmhouse. He made coffee on a gas stove, black and bitter, then filled the tin bowl with water from one of the few barrels he still had left. Rusty would lap at the water carefully, as if the old dog understood how precious it was. After that, Clarence would load his shovel, pickaxe, and rope into the back of his truck and drive out to the far side of the ranch. He had chosen a spot near the old pecan tree where the soil used to be soft and dark. If there was any hope left of finding water, it would be there. He worked slow but steady. The first day, the shovel met only dust and brittle roots. The second day, the ground hardened, forcing him to swing the pick until his hands blistered. The sweat soaked through his shirt and left pale rings of salt on his shoulders. Sometimes he would stop, stand straight, and stare at the horizon, where the heat shimmered like a mirage. There were no clouds. There hadn't been for months. But still, he kept digging. When the sun began to fall, he would climb out of the growing pit, his boots heavy with dirt. Rusty would be waiting at the edge, tail wagging weakly. Together, they would walk back toward the house, where Clarence would pour a cup of water for himself and one small bowl for the dog. Then he would sit on the porch, looking out across the dying land. The wind carried the faint smell of burnt grass. In the distance, the hills glowed red beneath the last light. At night, the valley was so quiet it felt haunted. He could hear the faint creak of the barn's roof expanding in the heat, the soft rattle of dry leaves scraping across the porch. Sometimes, when the silence pressed too hard against his thoughts, he turned on the old radio his father had repaired decades ago. The announcer spoke of relief funds, of new developments in the city, of farmers abandoning their lands and moving north. Clarence would listen until the static drowned the voice, then turn the knob off and sit there in the dark, feeling the heavy pulse of his own heartbeat echo against the walls. He had received a letter from the county just last week. Taxes overdue. Another warning. The officials didn't care that the land could no longer produce. They only cared that he paid. He had folded the letter neatly and set it under a small brass weight on his table. He hadn't looked at it since. The bank had already taken his neighbor's property to the east. Clarence had watched the bulldozers flatten the house, watched the family drive away with their few belongings strapped to the roof. The image had stayed with him like a shadow. He knew the logic of leaving. He knew how easy it would be to sell, to take what little the county offered and start over somewhere with rain and green hills. But this ranch was more than soil and wood. It was his inheritance, not in money, but in struggle. His great-grandfather had worked this land with bare hands. His father had plowed it under storms and debt. To walk away would be to erase their names. Clarence could not do that. One evening, after another day of useless digging, he stood over the hole and looked down. The walls were already chest-deep. The air inside was cooler, a strange comfort. He rubbed the sweat from his brow and leaned on his shovel. Rusty was pacing nearby, ears twitching. Clarence felt something stubborn rise inside him, a mixture of pride, anger, and exhaustion. "We'll find it," he said softly, though no one was there to hear him. The sound of his voice in the empty field made him pause. Then he gripped the shovel again and kept working until the last trace of sunlight faded from the sky. Days turned into weeks. His muscles ached. His palms split open. The dirt he pulled from the hole piled higher beside it, forming a small mound. Sometimes he thought he saw darker soil, signs of moisture, but each time it turned out to be only shadow. The ground resisted him like an old enemy. Yet every morning he returned, climbing down with his tools, swinging and scraping until his body felt hollowed out. The neighbors stopped coming by. A few would pass on the road, slow their trucks, and shake their heads. "Ain't no water left in this valley," one of them had said. Clarence didn't answer. He just nodded and kept digging. At night, he dreamed of rain, the kind of rain that came with thunder, soaking the earth until it turned to mud. He could almost smell it in his sleep, but when he woke, the air was always dry. He thought often of his father during those long days. The old man had died in that very house, sitting at the kitchen table, a half-finished cup of coffee beside him. Clarence remembered his father's last words. "Don't let it go to waste, son." He hadn't meant the water. He'd meant the land itself, the responsibility, the story that began here. Clarence had promised, and promises were something you kept, even when they hurt. By late August, the pit was nearly 10 feet deep. The sun was merciless. Clarence's shirt clung to his back. He had lost weight, and his shoulders carried the strain of every swing. But there was a strange peace in the routine. The world above might have been falling apart, but down there, in the hole, it was just him, the soil, and the rhythm of effort. Rusty would lean over the edge sometimes, his shadow moving across the wall like a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone. One afternoon, as the sky burned white, a dry wind came rolling down from the hills, carrying with it the smell of dust and something metallic. Clarence wiped his face and looked around. The landscape rippled under the heat. He felt dizzy for a moment, then climbed out of the hole and sat in the shade of the pecan tree. The bark was warm against his back. He thought about his great-grandfather digging that first well, believing the earth would give what they needed if they just kept at it. Maybe the old man had felt the same kind of exhaustion, the same fear. He closed his eyes and imagined the sound of water, a slow trickle, maybe a distant echo of rain underground. It wasn't real, but it calmed him. When he opened his eyes again, the sun was lower, the shadows stretching long across the cracked soil. Rusty trotted over and rested his head on Clarence's knee. The man smiled faintly and scratched behind the dog's ears. As darkness began to gather, he climbed back into the pit one more time, determined to dig until he couldn't feel his arms. The soil was cooler now, almost damp in the deeper layers, and he took that as a sign. He lost track of time. The stars came out above him, faint at first, then sharp and bright. When he finally stopped, breathless, he leaned on the shovel and looked up at the circle of sky framed by the walls of the hole. It seemed smaller than before, but clearer somehow. He climbed out slowly, his legs trembling. The night was silent except for the faint rustle of the dry grass. The horizon glowed faintly with the lights from town, too far away to touch. Clarence walked back toward the house, Rusty trotting beside him, the moon rising behind their shoulders. Before going inside, he turned one last time toward the field. The hole yawned dark and still, waiting. He thought of it not as a wound, but as a promise, a place where the past and the future of his family met, carved into the same stubborn ground. Inside the house, he set his shovel by the door and washed his hands in the basin, watching the brown water swirl away. His reflection in the cracked mirror looked older than he remembered. He poured himself a small glass of the last remaining water from the jug and took a sip, slow and deliberate. Then he went to the porch, sat down, and stared out into the night. The stars trembled faintly, like faraway fires. Rusty lay at his feet, already asleep. The sound of the dog's breathing was steady, reassuring. Clarence tilted his head back and closed his eyes. The air was still hot, but he thought he could feel a hint of coolness coming up from the ground. It might have been his imagination, but it was enough to make him believe for a moment that the land wasn't dead, just waiting, patient as always for someone stubborn enough to keep digging. He opened his eyes again and whispered into the empty dark, his voice rough but steady. "There'll be water here again." Then he stood, looked once more towards the faint outline of the pit, and went inside. The night pressed close around the house, and the fields beyond it lay silent under the stars, dry but not yet defeated. That was how it began. The hole, the silence, and the man who refused to stop digging. The following week began with a heat so dense that the horizon itself seemed to blur. The sun rose white and merciless over the Harper Ranch, burning the mist off the hills before morning had even finished arriving. Clarence woke before dawn, as always, the room around him dim and still. Rusty lay by the door, tail flicking in his sleep. Clarence dressed in silence, his muscles stiff, and stepped outside. The sky was a pale gray, already brightening into the color of bleached bone. The air smelled of dust and iron. The pit he had been digging now sat wide and deep in the middle of the field, surrounded by small mounds of dry soil that the wind carried away bit by bit each day. He had lined part of the upper wall with wood to keep it from caving, but the boards creaked and shifted with every change in temperature. When he peered down into it that morning, the bottom lay in shadow, the air inside cooler, almost inviting. He could feel the faint pull of the earth, as if something below was waiting for him to return. He climbed down carefully, his boots scraping the walls, the rope tied around a peg he had hammered into the ground days before. The air grew thick with the scent of mineral and clay. When he reached the bottom, he paused for a moment, listening. There was no sound, only his own breathing and the faint rasp of the shovel's metal edge against rock. The silence below was different from the silence above. It had weight, a strange pressure that filled the chest. He began to dig again, the rhythm of motion steady, almost mechanical. Each stroke of the shovel cut through the earth with a dull thud. Sweat ran down his arms, darkening his shirt. From time to time, he stopped to wipe his face and look upward at the shrinking circle of sky. Rusty's silhouette sometimes passed over the rim, a flicker of movement against the light. The dog would bark once, short and sharp, then disappear again. Clarence smiled faintly when he heard it. By midday, the heat grew unbearable. He climbed out and drank from his canteen, the water warm but precious. He could feel the dryness in his throat, a constant reminder of why he was doing this. He looked around at the land, flat, endless, shimmering. There was no other life in sight. Even the insects had gone quiet. He sat in the shade of the truck for a while, letting his heartbeat slow before returning to the hole. Each day brought the same pattern: dig, rest, return. The deeper he went, the harder the soil became, until the shovel struck something solid. At first, he thought it was just another patch of limestone, the same stubborn layer that covered much of the region. But when he struck again, the sound that came back was hollow, metallic, like a faint echo through a pipe. He crouched down and pressed his ear to the ground. There was nothing but stillness, yet something in that hollow ring stirred curiosity inside him. He spent the next 2 days widening the pit around that spot, chipping away at the surface with the pickaxe. Every blow sent vibrations through his arms. The sound grew clearer, a deep, muffled resonance that did not belong to solid stone. He wondered if he had reached an old drainage pipe or perhaps a buried cistern from some forgotten homestead. The thought made sense. This land had been worked and abandoned long before his family came. People buried things all the time: tools, machines, even wells that failed. He imagined what his great-grandfather might have said if he knew that beneath his field lay the bones of someone else's labor. One evening, Clarence stayed longer than usual. The sun had dipped low, staining the horizon red, and the first shadows were stretching across the field. He could hear the cicadas starting their dry, rhythmic song. Rusty paced above, barking occasionally, but Clarence didn't stop. The sound beneath his shovel had changed, softer, more resonant, as if the soil concealed an empty space. He crouched and brushed at the surface with his hand, feeling the grit give way to something smoother, colder. When he lifted his lantern closer, the light flickered across a pale layer of stone, shaped not by nature but by hands. He frowned, running his fingers along the pattern. The surface was too regular, too deliberate. It reminded him of the old stone well behind the barn, the way the bricks had been stacked in perfect circles. He felt a strange tremor of recognition, though he couldn't say why. The air down there had grown different, too. Cooler, though the night above remained stifling. It carried a faint smell, not rot or dampness, but something mineral and old, as if it had been trapped for centuries. He stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the earth around him. Then he raised the pickaxe again. The blow landed harder than he expected. A sharp crack echoed through the pit, followed by a faint tremor underfoot. He froze. A small puff of dust rose from the wall, drifting through the lantern's beam like smoke. He set the tool aside and reached out to touch the stone. It vibrated faintly beneath his fingertips like something alive. Then the sound came again, this time deeper, a groan from somewhere beneath. Rusty began to bark wildly above, the sound echoing down the shaft. Clarence looked up. The rope swayed slightly in the darkness. He could hear pebbles falling, bouncing off the walls. Then, without warning, the ground shifted beneath him. The world tilted. He grabbed for the rope, but it slipped through his hands. The soil gave way with a sudden roar, and he felt himself falling, the lantern flying from his grasp, light spinning in wild arcs before everything went black. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on something cold and hard. His body ached from the fall. The air was thick with dust, choking and dry. For a few moments he couldn't tell if he was alive or dreaming. Then the silence reached him again. Total, heavy, unbroken. He coughed and pushed himself up. Somewhere above, faint and distant, he could hear Rusty's frantic barking, muffled by the tons of earth between them. The lantern had shattered, but the small flashlight he kept in his pocket still worked. He flicked it on, the beam slicing through the haze. What it revealed made him freeze where he stood. The space around him wasn't a narrow shaft, but a chamber. A room, wide and roughly circular, its walls built from carved stone blocks fitted with impossible precision. Dust covered everything like a thin veil of snow. He raised the light slowly, tracing the lines of the walls, the arches that curved overhead. And then the beam caught something at the far end of the room, a dull glimmer that flared into brilliance as the light moved across it. At first, he thought it was a trick of reflection, some scrap of metal buried in the debris. But as he stepped closer, the shape resolved. A figure, massive and still, lying on a stone platform. A bull. He stopped breathing for a moment. The thing was enormous, almost life-sized, crafted from what looked like solid gold. Its surface was tarnished with age, but gleamed beneath the flashlight, the metal rippling faintly under the dust. The horns curled forward in perfect symmetry, the body shaped with impossible precision, muscles frozen in mid-motion. The eyes, dark recesses beneath the brow, seemed almost watchful. Clarence took another step forward. Around the base of the platform lay fragments of pottery, shattered amphorae, rusted tools. There were markings carved into the floor, simple lines and patterns worn by time. He crouched and brushed his hand across one of them. The grooves were deep, man-made. He couldn't read what they meant, but something in them stirred a faint unease. He stood again, turning in a slow circle, the flashlight beam revealing more details. Niches in the walls, a collapsed archway to his left, what might once have been wooden supports long since rotted away. The chamber smelled of age and mineral dust, untouched by air or light for centuries. He tried to piece it together. A hidden cellar? Some old Spanish construction? Maybe part of the early settlements that had spread across the region before statehood? He remembered the stories his grandfather used to tell about buried missions and mining tunnels, but nothing had ever been found here. His ranch lay far from any known site. He sat down on a flat stone near the bull, his heart still racing. The beam of the flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. What was this doing beneath his land? Who had built it, and why had they buried it? He looked again at the bull's face. Despite the dust, the craftsmanship was extraordinary. The metalwork captured not just the shape of an animal, but something almost human in its stillness, an expression of endurance, of patience. Clarence rubbed his temples, trying to think clearly. The air was growing colder, the dust settling. His fall had dislodged part of the ceiling, leaving a slope of loose soil leading upward, but it was far too high to climb. He tested the walls, searching for cracks or handholds, but the stone was slick and ancient. For a moment, panic threatened to rise. He was buried alive, deep underground. The light of his flashlight flickered once, and his chest tightened. He forced himself to breathe slowly. Above, Rusty barked again, fainter now. Clarence cupped his hands and shouted, his voice hoarse from the dust. "I'm here!" he called, though he doubted the sound reached the surface. It came back to him in a hollow echo, swallowed by the chamber. After a few minutes, his fear dulled into a steady, focused calm. He wasn't a man to give in easily. He examined the slope of debris where the ceiling had collapsed. The soil there seemed looser, mixed with gravel and broken stone. If he could widen that gap, he might reach a point where Rusty could hear him more clearly. He started to dig, using his shovel and hands, tossing rocks aside. Every few minutes he stopped to listen, checking the stability of the walls. Hours passed in the dim glow of the flashlight. The air grew stale, heavy with his own breath. His arms burned with exhaustion, but he kept going until he saw a faint shaft of darker gray above him, light from the surface, thin as a thread. Relief flooded through him. He climbed as high as he could, shouted again, and this time he heard Rusty's bark answer immediately, louder, frantic with joy. By the time he managed to pull himself halfway up, the earth gave way beneath his boots, and he slid back down. He lay there for a moment, chest heaving, staring up at the narrow opening he'd made. The bull stood silently behind him, gleaming faintly in the scattered light. It looked almost alive now, its flanks catching the faint shimmer of dust in the beam. Clarence felt its presence like a weight in the room, not threatening, but undeniable. He rested for a while before making another attempt. The second climb went better. The hole widened, sunlight finally breaking through in a pale stream. He reached up, his fingers clawing through the dry soil, and pulled himself into the fresh air. Rusty was there immediately, whining and licking his hands, tail wagging hard enough to shake his whole body. Clarence sat back on the ground, covered in dirt, breathing deeply. The heat above felt like mercy compared to the chill below. He turned to look at the hole. It yawned wide and dark, a wound in the earth. From where he sat, he could see nothing of the chamber, no sign of what lay hidden beneath. Only the faint glint of something gold far below when the sunlight caught it at the right angle. He wiped the sweat from his face and tried to understand what had just happened. The land he thought he knew had opened itself like a secret. As the sun climbed higher, he stood and brushed off his clothes. His hands were trembling, but not from fear. He knew what he had found was no ordinary thing. Whatever that room was, whatever that bull meant, it had been buried for a reason, and it had chosen his field to reappear. He looked out across the horizon, the fields stretching into the distance, dry and silent. Somewhere under all that cracked earth, generations had come and gone, building, digging, hoping for water or fortune. Maybe they had left behind more than anyone realized. Clarence took one last look into the pit. The air that rose from it was cool and steady, carrying the faint smell of stone and something older still. Rusty barked again, impatient, as if urging him back to the world above. Clarence nodded slowly. "All right, boy," he murmured. "We'll tell somebody. Someone will know what this is." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure who that someone should be. He glanced once more at the opening, the shimmer of gold barely visible in the shadows, and felt a strange tug in his chest, something between awe and dread. He turned away and began the long walk back to the house, the dog trotting beside him. Behind them, the hole stood silent under the blazing sun, hiding again what the earth had chosen to reveal. The wind stirred a little dust over its edge, whispering across the field. Then the sound was gone. The news spread faster than Clarence could have imagined. He had not planned for attention, had not even thought about what he would say when he called the sheriff the next morning. He simply did what seemed right. Something that large, that old, buried under his land. He couldn't just pretend it wasn't there. He had no way of knowing that by nightfall the quiet dirt road leading to his ranch would be crowded with vehicles, that by the following day the world he had always known would be replaced by one filled with strangers. The sheriff came first, a heavy-set man in a tan uniform who squinted at everything as if he didn't trust his own eyes. He listened to Clarence's story without interrupting, nodding slowly as the farmer described the collapse, the chamber, the bowl of gold. When Clarence showed him the hole, the sheriff leaned forward cautiously, shining a flashlight into the darkness. The light glimmered faintly off the hidden metal below. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, the sheriff straightened up and muttered that it looked like trouble. Then he said he'd have to call the county, maybe even the state office, because this was bigger than one man's find. By the next morning, trucks arrived. White government trucks with emblems Clarence didn't recognize. Men in khaki pants and sun hats stepped out, carrying clipboards and cameras. They asked him to stay behind the tape they quickly stretched around the hole. Clarence watched as they lowered a camera into the shaft, whispering to each other when the lens caught the glint of gold. They used words like artifact, colonial period, cultural significance. One of them, a younger man with square glasses, said something about how it could change what historians believed about the early settlements in this region. Clarence stood apart, hat pulled low, listening without understanding most of it. They spoke of history as though it belonged to them, as though the land were just a stage where other people's stories had played out. When one of them finally turned to him and asked how he'd discovered it, he simply said, "I was looking for water." The man smiled politely, not hearing the weight behind the words. Within 2 days, reporters began to arrive. Pickup trucks filled with cameras and lights, news vans from the nearest city. Someone had leaked the story. Farmer finds golden bull beneath his land. And now the world wanted a glimpse. Clarence refused interviews at first, but they were relentless. They asked him if he'd known what was under his property, if he believed in miracles, if he thought he had uncovered a lost temple. A woman with red hair and a microphone asked him what it felt like to stand on a fortune. Clarence looked at her blankly and said, "Feels like dirt to me." She laughed, assuming it was a joke, and the next day his words appeared on the evening news with a smiling headline. The county declared his property a restricted area pending an official investigation. Clarence was handed a packet of papers filled with legal terms he couldn't make sense of. He tried to ask when he could return to work his fields, but the man delivering the notice only said, "Until the assessment is complete, this area is under preservation order." They set up a perimeter around the pit, brought in portable generators, and worked late into the night. From his porch, Clarence could see the glow of their floodlights flickering against the sky like a silent fire. The days lost their rhythm. He no longer rose to dig or tend his animals. The cows, half-starved, wandered aimlessly near the fences. Rusty barked at the strangers, then lay down in the dust, defeated. Clarence tried to keep busy repairing the barn, but even that felt wrong. The land didn't sound the same anymore. The noise of generators drowned out the usual quiet hum of wind and insects. He watched as the men unearthed more of the chamber. They built a wooden platform over the pit and lowered ladders, hauling up pieces of pottery, fragments of tools. Each object was tagged and boxed. When they finally raised the bull, it took 6 men and a pulley system to lift it. Clarence stood nearby, silent, as the statue emerged into daylight for the first time in centuries. Even covered in dust, it was breathtaking. The sunlight hit the metal and exploded into color. The air around it shimmered, as if the heat itself bent to watch. Someone cheered. Others clapped. The lead archaeologist, a tall man named Dr. Hensley, announced that it was one of the most remarkable discoveries in the state's history. He said the bull likely dated back to the late 1700s, when Spanish expeditions had crossed this territory looking for silver and water. His team believed it might have been part of an unfinished aquifer project, a symbol of fertility and strength placed at the heart of a failed attempt to tame the desert. Clarence listened quietly. Every few minutes, someone would point to the bull, mention its weight in gold, speculate about its market value if it were ever sold. The number kept rising, millions upon millions. Each time, Clarence felt a little colder. None of them spoke about the land itself, the fields, the water that had never come, the hands that had built and buried that place. To them, it was a relic, not a labor. When the reporters returned, they wanted to know what he planned to do with his newfound treasure. He told them it wasn't his treasure, that it belonged to whoever had left it there, but that only made them laugh harder. The news anchor on television called him the humble farmer who struck gold. Another headline read, "Miracle in the Dust. Fate smiles on a poor rancher." Strangers began sending letters, offering to buy the statue, offering him fame, a new start, a life beyond the parched soil he called home. He ignored them all. By the end of the week, the county erected a temporary fence around the entire site. 2 guards were stationed there day and night. Clarence was given a pass to access his house, but the rest of the ranch was now considered an active excavation zone. He could no longer step near the place where he had spent the past months digging. He couldn't even take water from the barrels near the site. Everything, down to the smallest stone, had become evidence. One afternoon, while he sat on his porch cleaning his tools, an old neighbor drove up in a dusty pickup. The man leaned out the window, squinting. "They say that bull's worth more than this whole valley," he said. "You're a lucky man, Clarence." Clarence didn't look up. "Luck don't put water in the ground," he said. The neighbor chuckled uneasily, tipped his hat, and drove away. That night, Clarence lay awake listening to the distant murmur of voices and machinery. The sky was streaked with the faint glow of their floodlights. He imagined the bull standing upright on its platform, surrounded by men who would catalog it, study it, claim it. He felt an ache deep in his chest that had nothing to do with envy. The land had given him something extraordinary, and now it was being taken apart piece by piece. Days passed into weeks. Bureaucrats came and went. There were signatures to collect, permits to file. The government's language was polite but cold. The artifact, they called it, never the bull. Clarence's lawyer from the small town nearby tried to explain that there might be compensation eventually, once ownership was settled. But ownership was a complicated word. The state argued that because the fine lay below a certain depth, it belonged to the public trust. Clarence argued that it was on his property. The officials promised to review his claim. In the meantime, he was asked not to interfere, not to enter the dig site, not to speak to reporters without authorization. A stranger with a clipboard handed him a document to sign. "Just standard procedure," she said. Clarence looked at the long lines of small print and quietly set the pen down. "I'll sign when I understand it," he said. She frowned, then smiled thinly and left. The attention did not fade. Every few days, another article appeared. A talk show host called him the modern-day prospector. A historian speculated about secret cults and rituals. Clarence read none of it. He spent most of his time sitting on the porch with Rusty, watching dust devils spin across the road. The only sound now was the hum of the generators and the steady click of cameras. But even the experts began to argue among themselves. Some claimed the bull was purely symbolic, a token of agricultural hope. Others insisted it had been an offering, placed there when the settlers abandoned the project. One evening, Dr. Hensley came to the porch with a notebook in hand. He was polite, almost kind. "Mr. Harper," he said, "you realize this is an incredible opportunity. This find, your find, will make history." Clarence looked at him for a long moment before answering. "History's already here," he said. "It's been here the whole time." Hensley hesitated, unsure whether it was a reproach, then nodded and left. The summer dragged on, relentless. The sky remained empty. The grass refused to grow. Clarence's fields turned gray, brittle as parchment. He had no water for irrigation, and the county's restrictions prevented him from drilling elsewhere. His cattle were sold off one by one to cover expenses. At night, he sat alone at the table, the old lamp casting weak light on the unpaid bills that kept piling up. The letter from the bank remained under its brass weight. Sometimes he would glance at it, then look away. The reporters finally left when there was nothing new to show. The officials stayed longer. They built a temporary structure over the site to preserve the excavation from weather, though there hadn't been a drop of rain in months. The bull, he learned, had been moved to a laboratory for examination. Clarence wasn't told where. He tried to go back to normal work, repairing fences, tending the few animals he had left, but everything felt hollow. The land seemed unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else now. Even Rusty sensed it. The dog stopped roaming near the pit, choosing instead to stay close to the house, always watching the horizon. Sometimes Clarence walked out to the edge of the restricted zone and stood there, staring at the fence. Beyond it lay the wound in the ground he had made with his own hands, the place where everything had changed. He could still feel the shape of the bull in his mind, the strength of its body, the way the gold had caught the light like fire. But more than anything, he remembered the silence of the chamber. It had not felt sacred or mysterious. It had felt human, built by people who had worked and hoped just as he did. That thought stayed with him. As the days grew shorter, he began to wonder about the men who had built that place centuries ago. They had dug deep, searching for the same thing he had searched for: water, life. And like him, they had found something else instead. The proof that their effort mattered, even if they failed. He thought about their hands shaping the stone, their sweat mixing with the dust, their belief that somewhere beneath all this dry land, something good still waited. Now others were arguing over the remains of that belief. Historians, lawyers, collectors, all claiming a piece of the past, but not one of them had ever held a shovel in this dirt. Not one of them had ever prayed for rain. One evening, after a long, silent dinner, Clarence walked out to the porch. The sky was blood-red, the air heavy. He could see the outline of the fenced site in the fading light. He imagined the bull again, somewhere far away in a lab, stripped of its dust, polished under bright lamps, its value measured in currency and reports. The thought filled him with a quiet anger. It wasn't gold that mattered. It was the reason it had been buried in the first place. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking softly beneath him, and watched the sun sink behind the hills. The land, though dry, still held its shape, its strength. He knew it hadn't given up on him yet. Somewhere below, deep in the stubborn rock, water still waited. And he realized that maybe the bull wasn't a curse or a treasure at all. Maybe it was just a message from those who came before, to keep digging no matter how long it took. The generators finally went quiet that night. The floodlights flickered out. The silence that returned was strange and welcome. Clarence sat there a long time, staring into the dark, his calloused hands folded on his knees. The land was his again, but it no longer felt the same. Something had shifted beneath it, and within him. The world above was still chasing its gold, but he was beginning to think only of water. The morning after the generators went silent, the quiet felt foreign. For months, the land had hummed with the restless activity of machines, voices, and footsteps. Now there was only wind, the soft rattle of dry leaves across the porch, and the creaking of the boards under Clarence's chair. The officials were gone, their equipment packed away, the dig site fenced and padlocked. A sign now hung from the gate, "Property of the state, no trespassing." Clarence had walked up to it the evening before, his boots crunching on the brittle ground, and read those words slowly. Property of the state. The irony had not escaped him. His family had spent generations breaking their backs to keep this land, paying taxes and debts, mending fences, and plowing through droughts. And now a few words printed on a whiteboard had claimed it back for the government. He didn't blame anyone in particular. The archaeologists had been courteous enough, even friendly toward the end, but their politeness only made the emptiness worse. They spoke of him with respect, called him Mr. Harper, and thanked him for his cooperation. Yet, when they spoke about the chamber and the bull, they used phrases like the Harper artifact or the Harper discovery, as though he were merely a footnote in their report, a useful coordinate. When the last truck left, the land seemed to exhale, a long, hollow sigh that drifted across the plain and vanished in the heat. In the days that followed, Clarence tried to reclaim some rhythm. He fixed the troughs behind the barn, cleaned the tools that had rusted from neglect, and patched the roof where the boards had warped. But even those small tasks felt heavy. The ground itself seemed changed, like something beneath the surface was watching, waiting. Sometimes in the stillest hours of afternoon, when the sun flattened the world into a sheet of white, he thought he could almost hear the faint echo of that chamber, the thick, muffled silence of stone and gold. Rusty had grown restless too. The dog often wandered near the fence around the site, nose low, pacing in the dust. Clarence would whistle him back, but the animal always hesitated, looking toward the locked gate with pricked ears. Once or twice, Clarence followed him, standing a few feet from the boundary, his hand on the rough wire mesh. The air there felt different, cooler somehow. He didn't dare climb over, not because of the law, but because of something older, a feeling that the ground there still belonged to the dead hands that had built it. One afternoon, unable to bear the idleness, Clarence drove into town. He hadn't been there in weeks, not since the reporters had packed up and gone. The main street was quiet. A few people nodded to him as he passed, others looked away, unsure of what to say. The story had turned him into a local curiosity, half hero, half fool. In the window of the diner, he saw a newspaper clipping taped to the glass. Golden relic found on Harper Ranch. Beneath it, a small photograph of the statue gleaming under bright lights. It looked clean now, polished. Beneath the picture, the caption read, "Artifact to be displayed in State Museum after conservation." Clarence stared at it for a long time. The bull no longer looked like the one he had touched, covered in centuries of dust, lying silent under the earth. The light in the photograph was harsh, clinical. It stripped the metal of its mystery, turning it into something cold and distant. He realized that what he had seen in that chamber was gone forever, transformed by other people's hands into a thing to be looked at, not understood. Inside the library, the air was cool and smelled of paper and lemon polish. The building was nearly empty, just an old woman behind the desk and a man reading at the far table. Clarence approached the counter. "I'm looking for anything on the Spanish settlements around here," he said. The woman blinked at him, then smiled faintly. "You mean the missions? Or the mining records?" He shrugged. "Whatever there is. Something about water projects, maybe. Wells, reservoirs, anything like that." She led him to a section near the back where the shelves leaned under the weight of history books and binders of local archives. He spent the afternoon flipping through pages, tracing the faded maps with a finger. There were mentions of expeditions, Spanish engineers who had come north in the late 1700s, chasing rivers that didn't exist. They had built stone cisterns and tunnels in the hope of capturing underground water, but most of those projects had failed. Some settlements were abandoned, others absorbed by ranchers or storms. In one brittle document, he found a single paragraph that made him stop. A group of laborers, mostly freedmen and indigenous workers, were employed to dig a subterranean chamber in the lower plateau region. The purpose was to reach a hidden aquifer. Work halted after a collapse killed several workers. The remaining men buried the site and marked it with a symbol of strength, a bull cast from melted coinage, and left, believing the earth itself had refused their labor. Clarence sat very still, the paper trembling faintly in his hands. The words felt like a message sent through time. He imagined those men, sweating in the heat, swinging their picks against the same stubborn ground he had fought. They had worked for water, not gold. The statue had been their reminder, maybe a promise, that labor meant something even when it failed. It wasn't wealth they'd buried, it was hope. When he left the library, the sun was setting, the streets glowing orange. He drove home in silence, the wind rushing through the open window. The land looked different now, not as barren as before. It was still dry, still cracked, but beneath the dust, he sensed something deeper, a story that belonged not just to his family, but to all those who had ever tried to make this place yield. That night, he took out his father's old notebooks, the ones filled with weather logs and planting notes. Between the neat lines of rainfall records and crop tallies, he began to add his own writing, not about gold or statues, but about the men who had built that chamber, the collapse that had buried them, and the quiet they left behind. His handwriting was slow, careful, each word measured. He didn't know who would ever read it, but it felt right to put their story back into the soil somehow. The days grew shorter as summer leaned toward fall. The heat broke once, briefly, when a small storm rolled across the hills, dropping a few minutes of rain. It wasn't enough to fill the troughs or soften the ground, but the smell of it, wet dust, warm and metallic, made Clarence close his eyes and breathe deeply. He remembered his great-grandfather telling him that the land had a memory, that it never forgot kindness or pain. Maybe this was its way of remembering. A week later, a car pulled up to the house, a clean white sedan with government plates. A woman stepped out, neatly dressed, carrying a briefcase. She introduced herself as a representative from the Historical Commission. Her voice was polite, rehearsed. She told him the site had been confirmed as an important cultural landmark, and that his cooperation had been appreciated. She also said the state was finalizing the legal process of acquisition. He would receive compensation for the portion of land containing the excavation. It was, she said, a fair sum. Clarence listened without interrupting. When she handed him the folder with the documents, he didn't open it. "You can read it later," she said, smiling thinly. "We just need your signature to close the matter." He nodded slowly, but didn't reach for the pen. "Tell me something," he said. "Do you know what they were building down there? The men who made that place?" She hesitated. "The report suggests a storage chamber of some kind, possibly for rituals, maybe for—" "No," Clarence interrupted softly. "They were digging for water." The woman blinked, her smile faltering. "Well, perhaps, but that's not really relevant to the ownership process." Clarence's gaze didn't leave her. "It's relevant to me." She cleared her throat, adjusted her glasses, and said she would come back in a few days to give him time. When she left, the sound of her tires faded quickly into the dry wind. That evening, he walked back to the fence, the dog trotting beside him. The sun was low, turning the field into a sheet of bronze. He stood there, fingers resting on the cool wire, and looked at the silent mound of soil within. Somewhere beneath it lay the traces of men who had believed, as he did, that the earth would eventually yield what it owed. He imagined them lowering the bull into place, sealing it under stone, their hands blistered and strong. He wondered if they had cursed the land when the water never came, or if they had simply accepted it, trusting that someone else, someday, would finish what they began. For the first time in weeks, he felt something close to peace. The anger that had followed the excavation, the frustration, the sense of violation, all of it eased slightly as he realized that the story didn't end with the officials or the museum. The real story was older, heavier, and it lived in the ground itself. That night, after supper, Clarence opened a blank notebook and began sketching the layout of his land. He marked the spot of the chamber, the line where the ground had caved, the direction of the dry stream bed nearby. He compared it with the old maps from the library, tracing where the ancient tunnels might have run. A pattern began to emerge, subtle, but there. The workers of that long-ago expedition had not chosen the location at random. They had been following the path of underground springs, long dried but still faintly marked by the terrain. An idea took hold, steady and quiet. He realized that if they had almost reached water once, maybe it could still be found. The equipment today was better, the understanding of the land deeper. The thought filled him with a calm determination. The bull had been their symbol of endurance, not their failure. Perhaps this was what it meant to inherit the land, not the ownership papers or the fences, but the responsibility to keep digging where others had stopped. When he went to bed that night, he dreamed of the chamber, not as it was, but as it might have been when it was first built. Men swinging hammers, their faces streaked with sweat, calling to one another in a language of work. The sound of stone breaking, the glint of gold in torchlight. And then, beneath it all, the faint whisper of water, just beyond reach. He woke before dawn, the dream still clinging to him, the air cool against his skin. He could hear Rusty moving in the other room, stretching. As the first light crept over the horizon, Clarence stepped outside. The sky was pale blue, clean, empty. He looked toward the locked gate one last time and nodded to himself. The past was buried there, yes, but not forgotten. The ground beneath his feet carried the weight of generations, men who had worked, failed, and hoped again. He felt their presence not as ghosts, but as echoes of effort, reminders of what labor truly meant. The land had always been a teacher. It gave nothing freely, demanded sweat and patience, but it remembered every touch. And now, as he stood in the morning light, Clarence understood that what he had uncovered was not gold at all, but a history written in earth, a story of men and their struggle for something as simple and as precious as water. The bull had not been placed there for worship or wealth. It had been left as proof that even in failure there was meaning, and that knowledge, he realized, was the real treasure the land had offered him. The following months unfolded like a slow argument between time and memory. The land had begun to cool, but the wind carried with it a dryness that no season could soften. Clarence worked what little soil he still had access to, though most of his acreage now lay behind the government's fence. He could see the warning signs from his porch each morning, glinting white in the rising sun, as if the earth itself had been repossessed by history. What had once been his fields, brown, silent, familiar, were now a heritage zone, words that meant very little to a man who had fed generations from that dirt. The letter from the Historical Commission arrived early one morning, folded neatly inside a large brown envelope. It was written in the polished, distant language of bureaucracy. They thanked him again for his cooperation. They acknowledged his contribution to the preservation of the state's cultural legacy. Then they outlined the compensation figure, printed in bold. It was more money than Clarence had ever seen in one place, yet somehow it looked smaller than it should have. He read the numbers 3 times, then set the paper down beside his coffee cup and stared out the window. The money would pay off the bank, maybe rebuild the barn, but what he wanted most couldn't be bought. A week later, a man from the county came to the ranch. He was tall, gray-haired, and wore a suit that didn't fit the dust of the valley. His name was Fielding, some kind of liaison between the state and the local authorities. He spoke smoothly, like someone who'd repeated the same speech 100 times. He told Clarence that the compensation was a gesture of good faith, that the government valued his contribution. "You've done a service to history, Mr. Harper," he said. "It's not every day a man uncovers something of this magnitude." Clarence listened quietly. The words meant nothing. They were just sounds. When Fielding handed him the papers to sign, he didn't take them right away. "I have a question," Clarence said finally, his voice low. "When do I get my land back?" Fielding blinked, surprised. "Your land, sir?" "The parts you fenced off. You said the excavation's over." Fielding's polite expression wavered for a moment. "The site remains under state jurisdiction, I'm afraid. It's been designated a permanent archaeological preserve. That means no farming, no construction, but you'll receive an ongoing easement payment each year." Clarence said nothing. His hands rested flat on the table. Fielding coughed, looked around the room, and added, "I know it's difficult, but think of it this way. You're now part of something much larger. This discovery will bring recognition to the region. Schools, museums, tourism." "Tourism?" Clarence interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "You mean people walking over what's left of my fields, taking pictures of what's under my house?" Fielding's smile faltered. "I understand your frustration, but the past belongs to all of us." Clarence's eyes hardened. "That's easy to say when it's not your land." The man cleared his throat, said something about being in touch, and left soon after, his tires kicking up a trail of dust that hung in the air long after he was gone. Clarence stood at the window, watching until the road was empty again. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. The following week, a letter appeared in the local paper. It was written by a professor from the state university, claiming that the Harper Bull should be relocated permanently to a public museum. The letter praised Clarence for his humility in allowing history to be preserved, but ended with a line that made his stomach twist. The find belongs to the people, not to the man who merely stumbled upon it. He read the sentence over and over until the words blurred. Merely stumbled upon it. As if his sweat, his hands, his labor meant nothing. As if the generations before him who had survived drought and hunger on this same ground were accidents in the great story of someone else's history. He folded the paper carefully and placed it in the drawer with the others. It joined the growing pile of letters, notices, and receipts, an archive of his own small war with the world. As the legal disputes deepened, new voices began to emerge. A local family claimed descent from the laborers who had originally worked on the colonial project. They demanded that part of the compensation be granted to them, as representatives of the builders. Their lawyer, a young man with sharp shoes and sharper words, appeared at Clarence's gate one morning, asking for a statement. "You're a descendant too," the man said brightly. "Wouldn't you like to stand with us?" Clarence stared at him until the smile faltered. "I'm standing where I've always stood," he said, and walked back into the house. The county held a meeting to discuss the matter. Clarence went, though he knew it would lead nowhere. The room was hot, the air filled with murmurs and the faint buzz of the ceiling fans. There were officials, lawyers, historians, and a few curious neighbors. Everyone spoke at once, their voices overlapping. Heritage, compensation, ownership, liability. When it was his turn to speak, Clarence stood slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. "You all keep saying the word heritage," he said. "You talk about who owns it, who gets the money, who gets to tell the story, but nobody's talking about the land. That bull was built because somebody believed water was under this ground. They died trying to find it. That's the story. You can't own that." The room went still. For a brief moment, even the fans seemed to stop spinning. Then someone cleared their throat, another shuffled papers, and the conversation resumed as though he had never spoken. Clarence sat back down. He understood then that there would be no winning here. This was not about justice or memory. It was about possession. The gold had awakened something in people, something greedy and ancient that no amount of law could quiet. When he returned home, the wind had picked up again, hot and restless. The dog met him at the porch, tail wagging uncertainly. Clarence sat down on the steps, elbows on his knees, and watched the dust drift across the fields. The fences glimmered faintly in the afternoon light. Beyond them lay the invisible line between what was his and what no longer was. He thought of the men who had built the chamber, how their hands had shaped the stones with purpose, how they must have argued too, over food, over work, over what they were owed, and in the end, all that remained of them was a statue and a hollow in the earth. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked out into the yard, barefoot, the soil cool beneath his feet. The moon hung low, silvering the tops of the dry grass. He stopped at the fence and looked toward the excavation site. The air was utterly still. Somewhere far below, beneath layers of rock and silence, the chamber waited, unchanged. He could almost see it in his mind, the bull lying proud and eternal, the dust settling over its flanks. It belonged neither to the state nor to him. It belonged to the ground itself. He stayed there until dawn, his thoughts turning over and over like stones in a stream. By the time the horizon brightened, He had made his decision. A week later, he drove into the county office. The clerk behind the counter looked up in surprise when he handed her the unsigned compensation papers. "You're here to finalize?" she asked. "I'm here to change the terms," he said. They directed him to Fielding's office. The man greeted him with the same rehearsed politeness, but his smile tightened when Clarence laid the papers on the desk. "I'll sign," Clarence said, "but on one condition. The money doesn't come to me." Fielding blinked. "I'm not sure I understand." "I want it used to drill new wells," Clarence continued, "for the farms around here, for the ones still holding on. You can call it whatever you like, a community project, a grant, I don't care, but every cent goes into bringing water back to this valley." Fielding leaned back, clearly unsettled. "Mr. Harper, that's unusual. You realize this is your compensation, your legal right." Clarence met his eyes steadily. "It's my land. It gave something up. I'm just giving something back." The man hesitated, then sighed. "You understand this will take approvals, time." "Then start the clock," Clarence said quietly. For a long moment, Fielding said nothing. Finally, he nodded, scribbled something in his notebook, and extended his hand. "You'll be remembered for this, Mr. Harper." Clarence shook his hand, but didn't answer. He wasn't looking for remembrance. He wanted water. When he walked out of the building, the air smelled faintly of rain, though no clouds shadowed the sky. The scent stirred something inside him, a faint echo of the past. The decision sat heavy in his chest, but it felt right, clean. The gold would no longer feed arguments or vanity. It would feed the earth. Word spread quickly. Some called him a fool, others a hero. A few farmers from the neighboring counties came by to thank him, awkwardly, hats in hand. The newspapers ran new headlines. "Harper donates gold windfall to save farms." For a brief moment, his name became a symbol, though he paid it little mind. The state approved the plan, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps for publicity. The funds were redirected toward an initiative to dig new wells across the valley. Engineers and hydrologists arrived, studying maps, testing soil, marking sites. Clarence watched them from a distance, standing beside Rusty at the edge of the field. The sound of their machinery echoed faintly through the dry air, a sound both familiar and strange. This time, though, it was not the noise of intrusion, but of renewal. When one of the engineers approached to shake his hand, Clarence asked only one question. "How deep do you have to go to reach the water?" The man smiled. "Depends on how patient you are." Patience, Clarence thought. That was something he understood. As the days passed and the first rigs began to drill, he found himself returning to the fence each evening, watching the horizon darken. The land still looked wounded, stripped bare, but he could almost feel it stirring, like something long dormant beginning to breathe again. The sound of the drills carried across the valley, rhythmic and determined. It reminded him of the shovels and hammers from his dream, the echo of labor that had once filled that hidden chamber centuries ago. One evening, standing in the twilight, he imagined the old workers watching from the edge of time, seeing the machines bite into the same stubborn soil. He hoped they would understand that their work hadn't been forgotten, that it was finally being finished in a way they might have wished. He turned back toward the house, the lights glowing warm through the windows. Rusty trotted beside him, tail flicking against his leg. The night air was cool, and for the first time in many years it carried the faintest scent of moisture. He couldn't be sure, but he thought he heard something in the distance, a low, steady hum, like the whisper of water finding its way through rock. Clarence stopped and closed his eyes. Maybe it was just the wind, maybe imagination, but it was enough. The land was answering, slowly, the way it always had, and for the first time since the day the earth had opened beneath him, he felt something close to peace. The first machines arrived in early spring, their engines rumbling like thunder rolling across the dry valley. Clarence stood at the edge of his field as the convoy of trucks and rigs carved deep tracks into the hard earth, their metal frames glinting in the sun. The state had made good on its promise. The compensation money had been converted into drilling contracts, supervised by engineers who carried digital maps and spoke in the language of geology. For the first time in many years, the land felt alive again, not with crops or livestock, but with purpose. He watched as they unloaded the equipment. Massive steel drills, cables, hoses, and long coils of pipe that gleamed like coiled snakes under the light. The men worked with confidence and rhythm, calling to one another in clipped shouts as they positioned the first rig. Clarence had never seen machines like these up close. They looked out of place in his fields, too modern, too mechanical, but there was something reassuring about their precision, the way they moved as if they knew what the land was hiding. The lead engineer, a tall man named McAllister, came over to shake his hand. His skin was pale, his grip firm, his face lined by years in the sun. "We've mapped 5 potential sites," he said. "If there's water to be found, we'll find it." Clarence nodded, saying only, "This land's stubborn. Don't expect it to give up easy." McAllister smiled faintly. "That's all right. We're stubborn too." The drilling began the next morning. The sound was unlike anything Clarence had ever heard, a steady, mechanical growl that carried for miles, mixing with the wind. Rusty hated it at first, pacing and barking until he finally grew tired and lay down in the shade of the porch. Clarence spent the day watching, arms crossed, as the machines chewed through the ground. Dust rose in thick clouds, coating everything in a fine film. Each rotation of the drill felt like the turning of time itself, reaching downward into centuries of silence. At first, there was only disappointment. The first site came up dry after 2 weeks of work. They hit shale, then clay, then a layer of limestone, so dense the drill heads cracked. The engineers cursed, packed up, and moved 1/2 mile east. The second attempt yielded the same result. Dust, rock, nothing more. Clarence could see the frustration building in their faces, though they tried to hide it behind professionalism. He didn't blame them. The land had always been stingy with its gifts. At night, after the crews left, he would walk the site alone, flashlight in hand. The air was thick with the scent of oil and metal. He'd stop by the boreholes, peer into the darkness, and listen. There was no sound, only the faint whisper of the wind passing over the opening. Yet, he always felt as though the ground were listening back. The silence wasn't empty. It was patient. By the third attempt, word had spread through the neighboring counties. Farmers came by to watch, leaning on their truck doors, hats low against the sun. They talked quietly, hopeful but skeptical. Some still thought Clarence was crazy for giving away the money. Others called him a saint. He ignored both kinds. He wasn't after thanks or miracles. He wanted what the land had promised long ago. The third site showed a flicker of possibility. The drillers hit a softer layer of sediment, darker in color. The engineers murmured to each other, analyzing the samples, measuring moisture levels. When McAllister approached Clarence that afternoon, there was a spark in his eyes. "We're getting trace amounts," he said. "Could be an old aquifer, maybe deeper than we thought." Clarence said nothing, but inside him something stirred, a cautious ember of hope. He knew better than to celebrate early. The land could trick you that way, teasing you with signs and then turning to dust again. Still, that night he couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch long after the stars had come out, staring at the horizon. The sound of the distant rigs carried through the dark, low and constant, like the heartbeat of the valley itself. Days passed. The drilling continued deeper and deeper. The workers' faces grew lined with fatigue. Dust clung to their clothes, their hair, their eyelashes. Yet no one stopped. They worked from sunrise to sunset, driven by something more than orders. Clarence could feel it too, that same old stubbornness, the quiet defiance that came from trying to wrest life from a place that seemed determined to stay barren. Then, one afternoon, the earth answered. It began with a change in sound. The drill, which had been grumbling steadily all day, suddenly pitched higher, a hollow note echoing from the depths. The crew froze. McAllister shouted an order and the engine slowed. The men leaned over the borehole, listening. Clarence, standing a few yards away, felt the air shift. The ground beneath his boots seemed to breathe. And then, from the black mouth of the hole, came a rush of air, followed by a wet, choking hiss. A thin jet of muddy water burst upward, scattering dust and grit. The workers cheered, some laughing, others shouting in disbelief. The stream grew stronger, clearing as it rose until a column of cold, clear water shot into the sunlight. It arced high, catching the light like glass, and fell back in a glittering spray that soaked the cracked earth. Clarence took a step forward, the shock holding him still. For a moment, he thought of the chamber, of the golden bull buried in darkness, of the men who had dug centuries ago hoping for this exact sound, the earth surrendering its silence to water. He felt his throat tighten. Rusty barked from the porch, tail wagging wildly. The smell of wet soil filled the air, rich and clean. McAllister came running up, grinning like a child. "We hit it," he shouted over the roar. "It's clean, fresh, look at that pressure. She's been waiting a long time to come up." Clarence nodded slowly, unable to speak. He walked to the edge of the pit, crouched down, and touched the water as it flowed into the temporary trench the workers had dug. It was cold, shockingly so, biting at his fingers. He scooped a handful and let it run down his palm, watching as it darkened the dust on his skin. For the first time in years, the ground beneath him didn't crumble. It held. It lived. By evening, the excitement had spread. Neighbors drove in from miles away to see it. Children splashed in the runoff, their laughter echoing across the valley. The workers built a dam of sandbags to contain the flow, channeling it into barrels and storage tanks. Under the setting sun, the whole scene shimmered with color. The orange sky reflected in the water, the rigs standing like sentinels, the people moving like figures in an old dream. Clarence stood a little apart, watching. He felt no pride, only a quiet satisfaction, a deep, bone-level gratitude that words couldn't hold. This wasn't his triumph. It belonged to the land, to those who had worked it before him, to those who would live from it after he was gone. The next days were a blur of activity. The engineers tested the well, measured flow rates, and began planning a distribution system. Pipes were laid, connecting the new source to nearby farms. Clarence helped where he could, hauling materials, tightening bolts, steadying the men on ladders. He worked until his hands bled, not because anyone asked him to, but because it felt right to sweat again for something that mattered. When the first pumps started running, the valley began to change. The air lost its bitterness. Dust settled. In the mornings, a faint mist hovered above the fields, something no one had seen in decades. The smell of water carried far, mingling with the scent of grass trying to return. Even the animals seemed to sense it. Birds gathered again along the fence lines. Cattle lowed softly in the distance. Life, cautious and hesitant, was returning. A local paper printed another story. Water returns to Harper Valley. They called him a visionary, a man who had turned gold into water. Clarence didn't read the article. He was too busy helping the crew connect another pipe. Fame had no use here, only work did. Weeks later, when the final rig was packed up and the engineers prepared to leave, McAllister came to the porch one last time. His clothes were stained with oil, his hands rough, his smile tired but genuine. "You did a good thing, Mr. Harper," he said. "Most folks would have taken the money and run. You gave this valley a future." Clarence looked out at the horizon, where the sun hung low above the new well. "It wasn't me," he said softly. "It was the land. It just needed someone to listen." McAllister nodded, understanding more than he said. He tipped his hat and left, the rumble of his truck fading down the road. That night, the valley was quiet again. The machinery was gone, the people too, but the air still held the sound of water flowing beneath it, a low murmur that blended with the wind. Clarence walked out to the new well, lantern in hand. The stars burned cold above him. The water glimmered in the faint light, steady and endless. He crouched beside it, dipped his hand again, and drank. It tasted like metal, like stone, like time itself. Rusty lay beside him, tail thumping lazily. Clarence looked out across the dark fields and thought of the Golden Bull once more, its silent strength, its unbroken patience. The men who had carved it had failed to reach the water, but their work had not been in vain. It had guided him, even from the grave. The cycle was complete. He sat there until the lantern burned low, listening to the whisper of the wind through the grass. The valley breathed again, slow and deep. For the first time since he could remember, Clarence felt no weight pressing against his chest. The fight was over. The water had come home. The weeks that followed were the gentlest Clarence had known in years. The air no longer carried the biting dryness that had once cracked the earth. Now it was heavy, with the faint scent of moisture and new growth. The valley had changed. Patches of green began to appear where the ground had been bare for decades, tiny blades of grass pushing through the soil like hesitant hope. Each morning, the fields glistened with dew, and mist hung low over the horizon, softening the jagged edges of the hills. It felt, for the first time in a long while, like the land was breathing again. Clarence had fallen into a new rhythm. He woke before sunrise, fed the few remaining cattle, and walked out to the well before the light had fully touched the fields. The water flowed steadily now, a clear, unending stream channeled into pipes that snaked away toward neighboring farms. When the pumps started each morning, their low hum filled the valley like a heartbeat. He would crouch beside the well, dip his hands into the cool water, and drink. It always startled him, that coldness, a reminder that what had come from beneath the ground was untouched by heat or time. It was as though the earth had been saving it, keeping it safe for the day someone would have the patience to find it again. He spent his days repairing the fences and planting a few rows of crops, not for profit, but for the comfort of routine. The soil was still rough, stubborn, but now it responded when he pressed his fingers into it. It felt alive. The first shoots of corn appeared after 2 weeks, pale and fragile, trembling under the breeze. Clarence found himself standing over them longer than he meant to, almost afraid to blink in case they disappeared. Rusty followed him everywhere, his muzzle graying, his steps slower now, but his eyes still sharp. When Clarence spoke to him, the dog tilted his head as if listening to the tone more than the words. There was something steadying in that companionship, the quiet presence of another living thing that had shared the long waiting. The valley was no longer silent. Where once there had been only wind and dust, there were now the faint sounds of life returning, cattle lowing in distant pastures, the creak of irrigation pipes, the laughter of children from a neighboring farm. The water had changed everything. People who had nearly abandoned their land were returning, patching roofs, plowing fields that had lain fallow for years. Trucks rumbled down the old dirt road again, carrying tools and seed, and sometimes people would slow when they passed Clarence's gate, honking once or waving through the window. He would raise his hand in return, but words still came hard to him. It was enough to watch. News of the restored water spread far beyond the county. Reporters returned briefly, their cameras gleaming, eager to capture the story's ending. They filmed the well, the fields, the man who had traded gold for water. One asked him if he regretted giving up the money now that the land was thriving. Clarence looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You can't drink gold," he said, then turned away. It was the only thing he said to any of them, and the only line they used in their broadcast that night. By midsummer, the new water lines had reached every ranch in the valley. The small cooperative of farmers, once on the brink of ruin, was thriving again. They pooled their resources, repairing ditches, planting shared crops, and building a reservoir near the foothills. When they asked Clarence to serve as the head of the new water board, he refused gently. "I've had enough of titles," he said. "Just keep it running." But they named the project after him anyway. The sign at the edge of the reservoir read Harper Wellfield, a gift of labor and faith. He didn't like the attention, but he didn't take the sign down either. He knew the name wasn't really his. It belonged to everyone who had ever believed that the land could give back what it had once taken. As the season deepened, the museum sent a letter. The Golden Bull had been cleaned, restored, and placed in a permanent exhibit. They invited him to attend the unveiling ceremony in the Capitol. The letter was formal, printed on thick paper, ending with a handwritten note from Dr. Hensley. "It would mean a great deal to have you there. The artifact tells your story as much as it tells ours." Clarence left the letter unopened on his kitchen table for days. When he finally picked it up again, he folded it once and slipped it into the back of a drawer. The bull didn't need him. It belonged to history now, to people who would look at it and see beauty or mystery, but never the sweat, the dirt, the broken nails that had brought it back to light. He preferred to remember it as it had been, half buried, covered in dust, lying in the dark like a sleeping animal that had waited for him to find it. Autumn came quietly. The heat faded, replaced by long, golden afternoons and crisp nights. The fields rustled with the sound of wind moving through the new crops. Clarence harvested what little he had planted, storing the corn in burlap sacks and stacking them neatly in the barn. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He spent the evenings on the porch, the light from the setting sun painting everything in shades of amber and red. Sometimes, as the sky darkened, he could hear the faint trickle of water in the pipes running underground, the sound of life threading through the valley like a song. One evening, a group of school children arrived in a bright yellow bus. Their teacher, a young woman from town, explained that they were studying the valley's renewal project. She asked if Clarence would speak to them about what he had found. He hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of being the subject of lessons, but the children's curiosity was genuine. They crowded around him, their faces sunburned, eyes wide. One boy asked, "Was the bull really made of gold?" Clarence nodded. "It was," he said. Another girl asked, "Were you scared when the ground opened up?" He smiled faintly, more surprised than scared. Then a small, serious-looking child raised her hand and asked, "Why did you give it away?" Clarence looked at her for a moment before answering. "Because it wasn't mine to keep," he said. "The people who built it long before me, they were looking for the same thing I was. Water. They didn't find it, but I did, so I just finished what they started." The children were quiet for a while, thinking it over. When they left, one of them slipped a small folded note into his hand. It said, in crooked handwriting, "Thank you for giving the valley water." He kept it tucked in his wallet after that, more valuable than any gold coin. The months drifted by. The well never stopped flowing. Clarence grew older, slower, but his days remained full. He took comfort in routine. The creak of the porch steps under his boots, the smell of wet soil after irrigation, the sound of Rusty's nails tapping softly on the wooden floor. The dog aged beside him, sleeping longer each day, until one morning he didn't wake. Clarence buried him under the pecan tree near the house, where the shade was cool and the earth soft. He marked the spot with a flat stone and sat there until sunset, listening to the breeze whisper through the leaves. It was the same spot where he had first decided to dig years ago, when the ground was hard and hopeless. Now it was rich with life, grass growing thick and green around the tree's roots. When winter came, the valley did not die the way it used to. The grass stayed green beneath the frost, and the ponds that had been empty for years remained full. The farmers held a small gathering at the reservoir to celebrate the first anniversary of the water's return. They roasted food, played music, and shared stories of how their fortunes had changed. Clarence came late and stayed at the edge of the crowd, listening. When they spotted him, someone handed him a cup of warm cider and urged him to speak. He raised the cup slightly and said, "This wasn't a miracle. It was work. Work and patience. That's all." The crowd applauded anyway. That night, he returned home under a sky so clear it seemed endless. The stars shimmered, reflected faintly in the puddles along the road. When he reached the porch, he stopped and looked out over the valley one last time before going in. The land lay quiet, peaceful, full of the soft sounds of water moving through it. The horizon glowed faintly with the lights from nearby farms, the world no longer as empty as it had once been. He sat down by the window, the lamplight flickering over the table where the old photograph of his father still stood. He thought of the men who had built the chamber, of the gold bull resting in its museum case hundreds of miles away, of the way sunlight had once glinted off its horns deep underground. The water and the gold had always been two halves of the same story, the earth's promise and the human will to uncover it. Now both had found their places, one buried, one flowing, both enduring. Before going to bed, he stepped outside once more. The air was cold, sharp with the smell of winter. The well stood in the distance, its rim shining faintly under the moonlight. Clarence walked to it, crouched down, and touched the stone edge. The water below reflected the sky, still and perfect. He saw the stars ripple when he moved his hand through it, golden light bending on the surface. For a moment, it looked just like the glint of the bull's metal hide, as if the gold had melted into the water itself. He smiled at the thought, a quiet, knowing smile, and let his hand rest there for a long time. The land no longer asked anything of him. It had given what it could, and he had given what he must. The circle was complete. The valley that had once been silent now sang softly through its running water, carrying with it the memory of those who had labored before him, of the man who had kept digging, and of the gold that had become life. The night wind moved gently through the fields, whispering over the grass and through the pecan tree, and somewhere, deep in the ground, the earth sighed with contentment. Clarence turned back toward his home, the well still glimmering behind him and the stars reflected in its surface like coins scattered in a dark, endless sea. If this story moved you, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. There are more true stories waiting, deeper, stranger, and more powerful than this one. Watch the next video right now and share this one with someone who still believes hard work can change everything.